Chris Gardner is a father who is persistent, honest, smart, high morale and has big dreams to make his family happy, like most of us. To realize his dream, he dared to take the offer to become a distributor of a sophisticated medical device. Chris dared to take risks and used almost all of his savings to buy stock supplies of medical devices and have exclusive marketing areas in his city. After trying to market, he realized that the medical device for most doctors is quite expensive and less needed, whereas at least he had to sell 2 devices to pay rent and also his daily living expenses, but this time he had to be able to sell more than 2 devices to pay for his car that was ticketed, and the problem is that until the end of this month Chris has not succeeded in selling a single device. The presence of a child and the cost of living continues to make Chris begin to struggle financially. Linda, his wife, had to work 14 hours a day at the laundry to help pay for the family's life, while his son named Christopher every day must be left in a daycare center that is also cheap. One night Linda began to get annoyed with Chris because until that moment Chris had not paid his tax bill, because if it was not paid immediately then the tax man would take all the money in their account, where the money in their account was only enough for 1 month's living expenses. That night Chris listened to a TV broadcast about the economic difficulties in his country while trying to finish his son's Rubik's game. The next day when Chris started selling his merchandise again he accidentally met someone who used a luxury car and asked what he did, and how he could get it. Chris told his wife about that dream, the dream of becoming a broker, but his wife, who was still upset, mocked Chris and told him to immediately sell all his medical equipment so that they could immediately pay the rent for the house that was due next week, which they had been in arrears for 2 months. After a brief debate, Chris started back to hawking her wares again, but this time she tried to strengthen her heart to dare to join the broker training program held by the company Dean Witter Reynolds. She entrusted her wares to a busker and gave him money in return. Inside, Chris met with the broker team and explained that Chris had to meet someone named Jade Whistle at the head office. In the middle of the chat Chris saw the busker carrying his merchandise, so Chris was forced to leave the office and immediately chased him. Losing just one merchandise is like losing money to live for 2 weeks for Chris. In the train Chris saw the form sheet given by the broker team earlier where the program will only take 20 people every 6 months, and only 1 person will get a job, while Chris's last education is only up to high school. The next day when Chris took her son to the daycare center, Chris explained about writing happiness that must use the letter I so that the pronunciation can be correct. After that, Chris was surprised by his son's question about some war movies that he watched at the daycare center, whereas Chris should have been given some lessons there. So the daycare center there was also like a kindergarten school for children. Apparently the owner of the place deliberately made Chris watch movies all day because Chris himself was always late in paying the daycare fee. After that Chris immediately went to the broker training center and waited all day to meet with Jade Whistle to submit his application in person. Chris hoped that this person named Jade Whistle would help and embrace him to get a job. Due to waiting for Jade Whistle, Chris was late to meet one of the doctors who had given him time to demo his merchandise, even though the opportunity was very difficult for him to get. Luckily the doctor was still willing to give him 30 minutes, but again his time had to be wasted because he had to chase a busker who had previously stolen his merchandise. As a result his wife Linda had to see Chris go home with 2 of his merchandise. Instead of selling it he added more merchandise to it. After celebrating Christopher's birthday, Linda became even angrier and worse. This time Linda didn't want to care about what Chris would do and what would happen to him. Their relationship became even worse because of the economic factors that kept pressing them. 1 month has passed since Chris sent the application letter for the training program, and today she deliberately met Jade Whistle to introduce herself and remind about the application letter that was submitted a month ago. But because Jade was in a hurry to leave, Chris finally lied that she also had plans to go to the same destination. In the taxi, Chris tried to make himself known by telling his story, but Jade Whistle didn't care because he was busy finishing his Rubik game, until finally Jade was impressed by Chris who could finish the Rubik game in the right time. Chris's attempt to show his skills at work has failed. Now he is confused about how he should pay the very expensive taxi bill, while he only has $5 and even then it is for his food costs later. So by force at the red light Chris runs away with his merchandise. He ran all the way to the subway station, but just as he was about to enter the train, the merchandise slipped out and fell off. In the middle of the night in the pouring rain, Chris tried to call Linda and apologize that he would be late home, even though Chris had to get home immediately to accompany his son because Linda herself was leaving for work. Because of her upset, that night Linda decided to leave Chris as well as take Christopher with her. That night became a night of destruction for Chris, she began to think about establishing herself to pursue happiness so as not to suffer anymore because of lack of money. Arriving at home, Chris couldn't find his wife and children. Now Linda really left him. In the midst of sadness, suddenly Jade Whittle called and gave good news, that the day after tomorrow Chris could attend the interview for the broker training program. Jade asked Chris to write down the number of his secretary to get more information, but because he did not find a ballpoint pen, so he was forced to memorize the number of Jade's secretary. After that, Chris hurriedly ran to a supermarket by continuing to memorize the secretary's number. There he immediately wrote down the number as well as asked the whereabouts of Linda and Christopher to them. Before leaving, Chris also had time to warn one of his friends named White to immediately pay his debt of $14. In the afternoon, Chris picked up Christopher at daycare. Chris decided to stay with his son because he didn't want Christopher to have the same fate as him, namely growing up without a father's love. While they were both having dinner, the owner of the house suddenly came and said that Chris and his family had to leave the house tomorrow morning. There Chris asked for time to pay. Fortunately, the owner of the house gave 1 week with the condition that Chris had to repaint their house. The next day when Chris started painting the house, suddenly the police officer came and took Chris to the police station, because until now Chris had not paid the ticket. The police were forced to detain Chris and would release her tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. until the problem was solved, but tomorrow morning at 10:15 a.m. Chris had to attend an interview for a broker training program. After that, Chris tried to call Linda and asked for help to look after Christopher. Chris did not tell her about the problems she was having. She just asked Linda to look after and return Christopher when Chris returned. The next morning, after getting out of prison with a very shabby condition, a lot of paint on his body, he ran to Dean Witter's office. In that room, Chris met with Jade and other officials. In the interview process, Chris tried to stay calm and tell the problems that happened to him, until he could wear shabby clothes at that precious time. There Chris told something and impressed the officials. After the interview, Chris decided not to continue the program, because Chris just found out that during the 6-month training process he would not be paid a penny, but Jade tried to convince him that this was a great opportunity for Chris. In the evening, when Linda dropped Christopher off, Linda said that she would soon be going to New York to her brother's place to get a better job there. Then Chris was given the news that she had been accepted into the broker training program. The day passed and Chris decided to move into a cheap motel with the help of White. After finishing cleaning up, they both played basketball together, and there the father advised his son and said, never let other people look down on you. If you have a dream, keep it and achieve it. Long story short, Chris finally decided to continue his training program even though he was not paid at all. From that training, Chris got a lesson, where so many calls equals so many opportunities equals more and more customers, and the more customers the more money. So Chris was full of enthusiasm. She kept trying to find more clients to get the job. She had to compete with 20 people who had a history of higher education. During the break time, Chris accidentally met someone who brought his medical equipment that was left behind at the train station, so he took advantage of the 10-minute break to retrieve the medical equipment, but unfortunately when he tried to chase the person, suddenly Chris had an accident. The impact that was so hard was not felt by Chris. Immediately he got up and looked for his shoes that were lost somewhere. As a result, he had to return to the office using only one shoe. In the following days of training, Chris felt that he was very low and not appreciated because one of his managers always told Chris to get things like a waiter, but Chris still did not give up. He always smiled through his days even though it was very hard. Chris had to manage her time between taking care of her children, her brokerage training, and selling medical devices to help with her living expenses, so she had to work 6 hours at the training center. Even to maximize her 6 hours, Chris didn't drink too much water so she wouldn't waste her time going to the toilet. After 2 months, Chris hadn't reached his target. He finally got the courage to offer his services to Mr. Ribbon, the #1 businessman in his region. Apparently the courage paid off, where Mr. Ribbon gave Chris the opportunity to immediately meet him within 20 minutes, but again the good opportunity had to be forfeited when his manager forced Chris to park his car. But Chris did not want to give up. Finally he ventured to meet Mr. Ribbon at his house on holidays with his children and merchandise. There Mr. Ribbon appreciated Chris's efforts, but he could not use the services offered by Chris because he felt he did not need them. When Chris and his son were about to leave, Mr. Ribbon invited Chris and his son to watch a baseball game, which Chris himself had promised Christopher to watch the game. There Mr. Ribbon introduced Chris to his business friends. The following months seemed to go smoothly. All the medical devices he had successfully sold. until one day Chris got a letter from the tax informing him that the bank had taken all his savings because Chris did not pay taxes, and at that time Chris was completely bankrupt because he only had 33 cents in his wallet. In the morning when he and his son were about to leave, the hotel owner yelled at him that Chris had to pay the motel rent immediately, because there was no other choice. Chris finally collected his debt from White, but White said that his debt had been paid off when he helped him move. In the park when Chris was daydreaming, he suddenly saw someone carrying his medical device. Chris always thought that the device might be the only help for him and his son, so Chris took back the device and planned to sell it. But on that day Chris didn't manage to sell it, until Christopher complained that he was tired because he had to keep following his father to sell his merchandise. When one of the doctors planned to buy the tool, it turned out that the tool was no longer functioning because there was one broken component. Finally they were forced to go home empty-handed. And even sadder, arriving at the hotel, it turned out that the motel owner had removed all of Chris and his son's belongings. When Chris invited his son to leave, suddenly his son had a tantrum and had to be calmed by Chris. His last choice was White. That night Chris planned to stay at White's house, but apparently White did not want to open the door for them. Finally they went to the station without any purpose at all. There Christopher fantasized if only the tool he was holding was a time machine. His father tried to comfort Christopher by convincing him that the tool was indeed a time machine. Then Chris told his son to dismiss the button and close his eyes, and after that Chris invited his son to imagine and go to a toilet. Apparently it was just a way for Chris to invite his son to sleep in a public toilet at the station. There Chris tried to put his son to sleep with only a tissue, and if someone wanted to enter the bathroom, Chris also tried hard to hold it with his feet. The next day Chris went back to training with her suitcase and clothes to the office. Even though her problem was quite heavy, she still tried to hide her problem from everyone. After returning from training, Chris asked his friend to allow them to stay overnight at his workplace, but his friend refused because his workplace could only accommodate women and children. Fortunately his friend gave information that there was a place that could accommodate homeless people that opened at 5 p.m. Without thinking Chris immediately went to the place, and he could see that to stay at the place you had to queue very long, and if the place was full then you were forced to look for another place. While queuing there is someone who snatches the queue from Chris, so that makes him quarrel. Fortunately a guard knows that Chris is the first to queue, and finally Chris and his son can sleep in a place that is arguably more feasible than the toilet station. At night the building guards had to turn off their electricity, so they had to sleep without any light at all, including Chris not being able to repair his tools. That night without any lights, Chris still used his time to study, because soon the employee eligibility test will be held. In the morning Chris had to carry all his belongings out of the place, so he left for training while carrying his clothes and luggage. Chris had to make the most of his work time, because he had to queue up at the homeless shelter at 5 p.m. Even to eat, Chris had to go to a church to get free food. Long story short, the employee eligibility test had arrived. This was the final determination for Chris to get a job as a broker, and to be able to queue at the shelter, Chris had to solve the questions quickly. Luckily he could solve all the questions including the essay questions. When he was about to pick up his son he met one of the officials who had interviewed him. The official borrowed Chris's money because he forgot to bring money to take a taxi, even though Chris's money was only one sheet left. And at night when Chris told his son to sleep, suddenly his son asked if his mother left because she didn't like him. Chris explained that his mother left because of her own will, not because of Christopher. Hearing that Christopher also said that Chris was a good father, Chris, who felt proud of his son, told his son to go to sleep immediately, while he was still trying to fix his medical device, until finally the device was working again and sold to one of the doctors in the area. After getting the money, Chris gave his son a gift by renting out a hotel overnight and taking his son on a vacation at the beach. And the next day when Chris returned to his training program, suddenly his manager called him and told him to immediately meet with the officials. There the officials reminded Chris that that day was his last day. With a smile on his face, Chris tried to toughen up to accept the decision, but apparently the officials announced that this was his last day as an intern and tomorrow he had to return to the office as a permanent employee. And after starting his career at Dean Water, now Chris has succeeded in establishing his own financial services company which he named Gardner Rich, and this movie is finished.